She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "You taste sweet." And just like that, everything changed. The cafe was quiet that late morning, sunlight spilling lazily across the worn wooden tables, catching the motes of dust in the air. He had chosen his usual corner seat by the window, laptop open but barely noticed, lost in the routine comfort of coffee and light chatter around him. And then she appeared. She didn't announce herself, she simply moved with an ease that drew the eye. He noticed first the way her coat brushed lightly against her shoulders, the soft rustle of fabric that somehow seemed intentional, even though it probably wasn't. Her hair, dark with streaks of silver, caught the light, falling in gentle waves around her face. There was something about the quiet grace in her posture that made it impossible to look away. Their eyes met almost immediately. A casual glance, nothing deliberate, yet it lingered. There was a calm assurance in her gaze, an unspoken confidence that made him feel at once smaller, and yet inexplicably seen. She gave a small, knowing smile, one of those smiles that carries both warmth and curiosity, and he felt the subtle pull of intrigue, like a gentle tug at the center of his chest. He tried to focus on his laptop, on the words he was supposed to be writing, but the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with a faint, floral scent, unmistakably hers, and it distracted him, made him aware of every little sound, every movement. Her fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug, and he noticed the delicate way she held it, thumbs brushing the smooth surface, knuckles pale in the sunlight. He realized he was watching, memorizing small details he had no reason to notice, yet couldn't help but see. A brief brush of her hand against the edge of the table as she reached for her sugar made his pulse skip. It was accidental, entirely mundane, yet the warmth it left lingering felt electric. He laughed inwardly at the absurdity of being affected by such a trivial gesture, but his gaze followed her anyway as she settled into the chair across from him. There was an ease to the way she moved, a subtle rhythm in her gestures, like she had practiced the art of being effortlessly present in the world. She spoke to the barista, her voice soft and low, and he realized how attuned he had become to her tone, the gentle rise and fall, the musical cadence that made the space around her feel quieter, more intimate. When she laughed at something small, a low, warm sound that seemed to hum in the air, he felt a ripple through him, a kind of quiet joy that was completely unexpected. And then she looked back at him. The smile was small, but it held an unspoken question, a hint of recognition, like she had noticed him noticing her. He swallowed, felt the unusual tension of wanting to look away yet unable to, and realized with a start that this simple encounter, this brush of presence, had already unsettled him. Something had shifted. The ordinary cafe, the familiar light, the background hum of conversation, all seemed to sharpen around her. For the first time that morning, he truly felt alive in the quiet way that comes from noticing someone deeply, from recognizing a moment that might, without warning, change everything. The cafe had grown busier by mid-morning, the murmur of conversation and clatter of cups forming a familiar background hum. He had moved his chair slightly to give himself a bit more space, yet somehow, when she returned from the counter, she slid into the seat across from him, closer than he expected. Not intentionally intrusive, but the way her chair nudged his brought a warmth that traveled from his knee up through his chest. Their knees brushed lightly under the table. It was accidental, almost dismissible to anyone else, yet it sent an unsteady flutter through him. He felt it immediately, that electric awareness of proximity. His hand unconsciously shifted, gripping the edge of the table tighter, while his eyes tried not to linger, but they did. He could see the delicate curve of her fingers as they rested near the cup, the faint tremor as she adjusted her posture. Every small gesture seemed amplified, charged with the tension of closeness. She spoke softly, commenting on the book he had left open earlier, her voice low enough that only he could hear. It wasn't flirtation in the overt sense, but there was something intimate in the way her words brushed against his ears, a warmth that made his chest tighten. He found himself leaning slightly forward, drawn by more than curiosity. Her presence was grounding, yet it carried a subtle, unspoken pull, a reminder that the simplest interactions could carry meaning when someone truly noticed you. The scent of her perfume seemed stronger now, mixing with the rich aroma of coffee. It wasn't overpowering, but delicate, floral, almost comforting. Each time she shifted, brushing a strand of hair from her face or tucking it behind her ear, he noticed the subtle motion of her wrist, the soft curve of her forearm catching the light. A part of him wanted to reach out, to touch that warmth, but another part hesitated, savoring the delicate tension between them. She laughed softly at something in his book, a sound that seemed to resonate just for him. Her shoulder nudged his briefly as she leaned back in her chair, the motion unintentional yet intimate, leaving him acutely aware of the small heat radiating from her. The ordinary moment became charged with something extraordinary, a quiet intimacy born from shared space, proximity, and the comfort of mutual awareness. Their eyes met again, lingering longer this time. He noticed the subtle smile tugging at the corners of her lips, the way her gaze seemed to search his face for understanding, for recognition. He wanted to speak, to fill the pause with words, but the silence was compelling, a soft, shared acknowledgement of the unspoken. In that brief, accidental closeness, he realized how much weight a small touch, a near brush, or even the simple act of leaning slightly towards someone could carry. The cafe, the chatter, the hum of espresso machines, all faded to a gentle backdrop. What remained was her, the warmth of her presence, and the magnetic pull of unspoken connection. By the time she laughed again, brushing her fingers lightly against the edge of his notebook as she gestured, he knew something subtle yet undeniable had shifted. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, curiosity, and the first flicker of emotional intimacy. The accidental closeness of the moment had quietly opened a door he hadn't even realized he was ready to step through. The cafe had settled into a steady rhythm by the afternoon. The hum of espresso machines and quiet conversations wrapped around them like a soft cocoon. He noticed her movements more acutely now, the way she adjusted her posture as she leaned in slightly to hear him, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her cup when she laughed. Each subtle motion drew his attention, making it impossible to focus on anything else. They had begun talking more freely, the earlier tension transforming into a kind of playful intimacy. She teased him gently about his serious expression, her voice carrying a warm lilt that made him momentarily forget his own thoughts. "You look like you're solving world problems in that book," she said, her lips curving in an amused smile. The comment wasn't flippant, it carried an understanding, a recognition that somehow saw through him, past the exterior, to the quieter, thoughtful corners of his mind. He responded with a teasing grin, matching her rhythm, testing the playful boundaries. "And yet somehow, you always manage to find me even when I hide behind my books," he said. The words felt lighter than his usual inner monologue, more spontaneous, more alive. Her laughter, low, rich, and easy, flowed into the space between them, and for a moment, he was entirely absorbed in it. As they exchanged words, he became aware of the subtle mirroring in their body language. When she tilted her head slightly, he found himself leaning forward as well. When she sipped her coffee, he mirrored the motion almost unconsciously. It was subtle, unplanned, yet it created a rhythm that felt private, a shared language of gestures. Each mirrored movement made the space between them feel smaller, warmer, more connected. He noticed the way sunlight caught her hair, illuminating strands of silver in ways that highlighted both her elegance and her quiet strength. There was something in the gentle lines of her face, the slight crinkle near her eyes when she smiled, that spoke of experience, wisdom, and resilience. He felt drawn not just to her appearance but to the life she carried within her, her stories, her laughter, the subtle confidence that radiated without needing to be stated. Their conversation began to drift toward more personal territory, though still light-hearted. She shared small observations about the cafe, about books she loved, about things she noticed in people. In turn, he found himself opening in ways he rarely did, revealing quirks, preferences, small reflections on life. With each disclosure, however minor, the tension between them softened into something more tender, more intimate, without needing to cross any physical boundary. And yet, the proximity of their bodies, the occasional brush of hands on the table, the shared leaning in to hear each other over the hum of the cafe, kept the air charged. It was a subtle, unspoken attraction, wrapped in humor and understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that both of them were noticing and savoring the connection growing between them. By the time their conversation wound down, there was a comfortable pause, one of those rare moments where silence is not empty, but full. He felt the warmth of her presence like a gentle weight against his side, a steady pulse of shared attention that left him both calm and aware of every sensation around her. Something was happening, something delicate and profound, and neither of them needed words to recognize it. The afternoon sunlight had softened, streaming through the cafe windows and casting warm patterns across the table. Their conversation, once playful and teasing, had shifted to a quieter, more reflective tone. She stirred her coffee slowly, her gaze distant for a moment, and he noticed a subtle tension in her shoulders that hinted at something unspoken. He had learned to read her small gestures by now, the slight furrow of her brow when a memory lingered, the way her lips pressed together when she hesitated to speak. He didn't rush her. Instead, he leaned in slightly, keeping his presence close but unintrusive, giving her the space to reveal what she wanted. The intimacy of proximity was already there, in the quiet acknowledgement of one another. Then she spoke, her voice softer than before, tinged with a vulnerability that made him pause. She told a small story from her past, a disappointment, a moment of loneliness she had rarely shared with anyone. It wasn't dramatic or overly sentimental, just honest, simple, human. And as she spoke, he noticed a faint tremor in her hands as they rested on the table, the way her eyes momentarily flicked toward him, searching for understanding, for acceptance. He responded not with words of advice or consolation, but with quiet attentiveness. His gaze held hers, steady and patient, letting her know that her trust wasn't misplaced. The warmth in his expression seemed to wrap around her, creating a protective space that encouraged her to continue. When she laughed nervously at her own story, he smiled gently, a soft acknowledgement that it was okay to feel, to admit fragility. At one point, their hands brushed lightly on the table. It was accidental, yet he felt the brief pulse of connection, a subtle, grounding warmth that seemed to say, "You're not alone here." She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers lingered just an instant longer, a quiet acceptance of the closeness, of the trust that had begun to form. He became acutely aware of the richness in the moment, the faint hum of the cafe, the scent of coffee mingling with her delicate perfume, the way sunlight glinted off the strands of her hair. Every detail seemed heightened, amplified by the emotional honesty between them. There was a rhythm to their exchange, a gentle ebb and flow of words and pauses, laughter and sighs, that drew them closer without crossing into overt intimacy. By the end of their conversation, there was a sense of calm, of shared understanding. The vulnerability she had offered wasn't heavy or burdensome. It was a bridge, a quiet invitation to step closer emotionally. He felt an unexpected warmth in his chest, a mixture of admiration and tenderness, and recognized that this moment, subtle, unassuming, and deeply human, had changed the way he saw her. When she finally smiled fully, without hesitation, it was luminous, gentle, and genuine. And in that smile, he realized something important: intimacy wasn't only physical. It could be built in the quiet spaces, in shared trust, in the careful, unhurried unfolding of oneself before another. And in that quiet revelation, the bond between them deepened, laying the foundation for the slow, tender romance that was only beginning to take shape. The cafe had begun to empty, the midday rush fading into a quieter lull. The sunlight softened to a gentle golden hue, and shadows stretched lazily across the worn wooden floor. He noticed every detail more acutely now, the subtle curve of her lips as she spoke, the slight catch in her breath when she leaned forward to emphasize a point, the way her eyes seemed to linger on his face just a moment too long. They had been talking for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly between humor, reflection, and quiet understanding. But there was a shift in the air, subtle and unspoken, as if both of them had suddenly become aware of the charged space they occupied together. It wasn't a matter of words, but of presence, the warmth radiating from her side, the unintentional closeness of her hand brushing the edge of the table. Then she leaned in. Not dramatically, not with overt intention, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her shoulder near his arm, close enough that the faintest brush of her hair against his cheek sent an unexpected shiver through him. The cafe's sounds, the hum of conversation, the clatter of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, faded into the background, leaving only the subtle rhythm of her breathing and the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. Her voice dropped to a whisper, soft and low, and he felt it brush against his ear, a private sound meant for him alone. "You taste sweet," she said, the words playful yet intimate, teasing yet laden with something deeper unspoken. It wasn't about literal sweetness. It was about the warmth, the closeness, the tiny pulse of connection that had been building between them over hours of shared glances, touches, and laughter. His chest tightened, an odd mixture of surprise, delight, and hesitation. He wanted to respond, to reach for her hand, to close the tiny distance between them, yet another part of him hesitated, savoring the exquisite tension of the moment. It was the kind of interaction that could easily be lost if rushed, yet each second stretched and lingered, heavy with possibility. He noticed the subtle details he might have missed before, the faint shimmer of sunlight on the strands of her hair, the way her eyes glimmered with quiet mischief, the tiny movement of her fingers as they traced the rim of her cup. The brush of her hand against the table was fleeting, almost accidental, yet charged with a warmth that seemed to reach through him. In that instant, the world contracted. All that existed was her presence, the teasing intimacy of her words, and the delicate closeness of their bodies. There was no rush, no pressure, only the slow, simmering pull of attraction, the quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful was unfolding. When she pulled back slightly, her eyes still locked with his, he felt a rush of both exhilaration and longing. It was a moment that didn't need to be named, a bold yet gentle step across the invisible boundary they had been navigating. The teasing remark lingered, a whisper that carried promise, warmth, and an invitation to explore the connection that had been quietly growing between them. By late afternoon, the cafe had emptied, leaving only the soft hum of distant conversation and the occasional clink of a spoon against a coffee cup. They had moved to a small table near the window, where the golden light spilled across the worn surface, painting patterns on the pages of the book he had left open. The quiet around them mirrored the subtle intimacy between them, a space where words could be honest, and silences could speak as loudly as laughter. She sighed softly, leaning slightly forward, her fingers brushing the edge of her cup. The gesture was almost imperceptible, yet he noticed the way her hand lingered, as if seeking steady ground. "I don't usually share this," she began, her voice low and careful. "But sometimes I wonder if I miss chances I should have taken." The words weren't dramatic. They were simple, personal, and deeply human. He felt the weight of her honesty settle between them, a delicate thread connecting them more closely. He listened, leaning in slightly, not interrupting, giving her the space to reveal herself. There was a quiet power in her vulnerability, a strength wrapped in hesitation, and it made him want to respond with equal sincerity. When she paused, searching his face for understanding, he reached out, letting his fingers brush hers briefly. The touch was fleeting, unassuming, yet it conveyed a quiet reassurance. "I see you. I understand you." Her eyes softened as she looked at him, a mixture of relief and something more profound. "It's strange," she said, "how someone can walk into your day, sit near you, and suddenly, you feel like you've known them longer than you have." Her words hung in the air, and he realized she was speaking not just about familiarity, but about the rare, fragile beginnings of trust and connection. He found himself speaking more openly than he expected. He shared small truths about himself, insecurities, hopes, the little patterns of his life that shaped who he was. Each admission felt lighter because it was met with her steady attention, her quiet nods, and the soft warmth of her presence. It was not the confessional intensity of romance novels. It was something more grounded, more human. At one point, her hand brushed his sleeve, accidental but deliberate enough to make him aware of the closeness. The warmth traveled up his arm, leaving a quiet thrill that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with connection. Their eyes met again, and in that shared gaze, there was an unspoken understanding. This moment, this honesty, was a turning point. The sunlight waned further, casting long shadows across the table, yet the space between them felt luminous, charged with a quiet intimacy that went beyond physical proximity. He felt the pull of something deeper, affection, trust, and the burgeoning certainty that their connection was more than fleeting curiosity. As they finally leaned back, a soft smile crossing her face, he realized that vulnerability had unlocked a door. Not a grand declaration, not a dramatic climax, but a tender acknowledgement of their growing emotional bond. It was slow, deliberate, and real, a romance rooted in honesty, awareness, and mutual respect, ready to take its next subtle step toward warmth and closeness. The sun had begun its descent, painting the cafe in hues of gold and amber. The quiet rhythm of the late afternoon, paired with the lingering scent of coffee and her subtle perfume, created a cocoon around them, one that felt removed from the world outside. For hours they had talked, laughed, and shared moments of gentle closeness, and now there was a soft, reflective calm in the air. He noticed her profile as she traced the rim of her cup with her finger, the subtle tension in her shoulders easing. There was a quiet grace in the way she moved, a serenity that seemed to radiate warmth into the space between them. Their conversation had slowed into comfortable pauses, the kind where words weren't needed because the presence of the other was enough. Finally, she looked up, eyes meeting his, and a small, genuine smile spread across her face. It was soft, unhurried, and full of meaning. In that smile, he saw all the hours of laughter, shared curiosity, and tender vulnerability reflected back at him. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had been building, a recognition that this connection, slow, deliberate, and emotionally honest, had become something deeply significant. As they prepared to leave, their hands brushed again, this time intentionally, a brief squeeze that spoke volumes. There was no need for words. The warmth of her touch carried gratitude, affection, and the subtle thrill of mutual attraction. He felt it ripple through him, a gentle echo of everything they had shared that afternoon. Stepping outside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier that morning. He walked beside her, just close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, sharing an unspoken comfort in proximity. Every glance, every small gesture, a tilted head, a soft laugh, a hand lingering near his, reinforced the quiet intimacy that had grown naturally between them. She paused briefly, turning to face him fully. "I'm glad we met today," she said, her voice low and sincere. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rushed, but it carried a weight of honesty and emotion that left him feeling lighter, yet profoundly moved. He nodded, realizing he felt exactly the same, a rare, unspoken understanding that transcended words. As they parted, there was a brief, deliberate hand touch at the door. Fingers intertwined for a heartbeat before she released him, leaving behind the warmth of her presence, the lingering scent, and the undeniable sense of connection. He watched her walk away, her steps confident yet gentle, and felt a quiet joy that was steady, grounding, and full of promise. Walking back down the street, he realized that this day, seemingly ordinary, punctuated by coffee, conversation, and subtle touches, had been anything but ordinary. It had been the beginning of something rare and beautiful, a slow, tender romance built on emotional intimacy, mutual respect, and the thrill of discovering someone who saw him as deeply as he saw her. In the quiet moments after she was gone, he smiled to himself, aware of a warmth that lingered, a sense of fulfillment, anticipation, and the subtle, perfect satisfaction of a connection nurtured slowly, intentionally, and entirely human. This was not a fleeting spark. It was the start of a bond that promised depth, tenderness, and the quiet magic of a romance unfolding exactly as it should.